Welcome back everybody to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's video we're going to continue our exploration of Nginx, the web server. Specifically today we're going to continue to look at our vhost and Nginx configuration and further customize a number of items. So let's spend a little bit more time on logging. We've talked about logging in the past and how we use the access log and error log directives either within the nginx.configuration file or in the virtual host configuration files to overload what we have configured on a domain basis. So let's go ahead and take a look at our etc nginx and vhost directory to see what we've set up. If we take a look at the www.myexample, which is the domain that we've been dealing with the most during our configuration examples, you can see that for both the 443 and 80 server, HTTP and HTTPS, we've defined the access log and the error logs going to var log nginx myexample error and access, so that we have something that's domain specific. If we look in var log nginx, we also see that there's an access and an error log that's for the overall system, not counting the domain that we have customized, because we're overriding at a domain level what happens to be in there. Now there's a couple of other things that we can do to better control our access and error logging. We can, for example, the access log can be buffered and it can be compressed. So let's take a look at that. So if we go into our vhost file for www.myexample, one of the things we can do for the access log is, and this is pretty common for busy web servers, is that you'll want to buffer the writes to that log. And the reason for that is it'll help increase performance. So when buffering is enabled, the data gets written to the file when A, the next log line does not fit into the buffer, B, the buffer data is older than specified by the flush parameter, or C, when a worker process is reopening log files or is shutting down. So how do we do that? Well, all we're going to do at this point is we're going to insert the buffer size that we want the file to be. And you'll want to keep this relatively small, and it should be smaller than the page file setting that you have, which by default is going to be 32K in most modern Linux distributions. So all we're going to say here for the access log is that when we have information to write, buffer up to 32K of information, and then write that when the next log line doesn't fit into the buffer. We're going to flush that out and write it to the file. This will improve performance so that you're not bogging down your system in I/O and constantly opening, writing, and closing a file with every web request. For lightly used web servers, that's not a big issue, but for web servers that are in heavy use, that can be a big issue because you're constantly writing to the same file. So you could have contention, particularly if you're sharing the access log with other processes or other domains. So in this case, if we go ahead and save our file and we do an nginx-t, we'll see that our setting is okay when we test the nginx-t. So let's go ahead and clear this screen. And let's take a look at what we can do for the error log. So our error log, for example, can be configured to listen for errors in various levels, called logging levels. So our error log right now is currently logging everything to var log nginx myexample.error.http.log. I know that seems long, but it's, as far as a file name goes, it's a file name that tells us exactly what we're looking at. It is the myexample error HTTP log versus an HTTPS, which we also have defined here. So there are 8 different error log levels that we can configure this for. They're emergency, for emergency situations where the system's in an unusable state. An alert, which is situations where action is needed. Critical, important problems that we need to address. Errors, obviously when an error has occurred, something was unsuccessful. A warning, something unusual happened but not necessarily something we need to take immediate action on. A notice, basically a message, something that's happened but it's just a message that we need to note. Info, an informational message that might be nice to know in the future, particularly if we're debugging, but in that case, we'd actually go to debug. So it would be debug information that we can use to pinpoint where a problem is occurring. So in most cases, you'll find that you're logging almost everything to your error log, but in development environments, for example, you'll set this to debug. So if we set this to debug and save the file and do an nginx-t, we'll see that our configuration is okay. Now, what does a debug look like on our error logging? So let's do a service nginx restart, and then let's generate some error level traffic, and we'll see what the difference between what an error looks like when it's logged normally versus debug. So we're going to run a links HTTP and www.myexample.local and something that doesn't exist .text. So we'll see we get our custom content does not exist page. This is the 404 custom error that we did in a previous video. So it's an error in our case. So let's do that. And let's generate something else. .jpg. And this will actually come up with an error page as well for our custom 404. Now if we go over to our var log nginx directory, we should see that we've got myexample.error.http log. So let's take a look at catting that out. myexample.error.http.log, and we'll do a more on it. So you can see the difference. There's a lot of information that's contained, and it's clearly marked as debug when we're running everything in debug mode. And it tells us everything from the file name and the internal processes that have happened through my Nginx system, including the internal redirects, which is the 404 redirect that we specified in our custom error message, the domain that was making the request to, the client that the request was coming from, and the page that was being requested. So in a development environment where you are developing a website and you want to capture all your error levels, the debug is the most common logging level that you'll find from an error perspective. From the access log perspective, you'll want to buffer for heavily used websites to prevent your web server from bogging down in I/O. And in the next video, we're going to show how we can customize our log formats so that our access log gives us information that might be useful under various circumstances. But for custom error logging and access logging levels and directives, that's all there is to it. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.